Sometimes even small details can reveal someone's terrible secret. That's how it turned out for me. I began to suspect that my wife was cheating on me, and every day I learned more and more. I had absolutely no idea what kind of person I was living with. As I entered the ensuite, I noticed a glimmer on the carpet, a reflection of sunlight just beginning to filter through the blinds. It wasn't blinding, but did catch my eye. I looked down to see what it was. Being barefoot, I didn't want to step on anything sharp, like glass. Caroline hadn't mentioned dropping anything in the bathroom, but who knows? At first, I couldn't see what it was. Without the light shining on it, it blended almost perfectly with the carpet. But eventually, I found it. A small circle of foil that had fallen to the floor and caught the light as I walked in. I picked it up. It was the backing from a strip of pills, the little foil circle that pops out when you remove a pill from the strip. Usually, it stays attached, but sometimes, as in this case, it falls off. I examined it closely. One side was blank, while the other had the marking Tuesday. Since it was Wednesday, I assumed it was for Tuesday's pill. This indicated the pills were meant to be taken daily. I wasn't on any medication, being 35 and in good health, and neither was Caroline. We had both recently had our annual checkups and were declared healthy, so why was there a pill backing in our bathroom? I knew there were several daily medications, but the first one that came to mind was the contraceptive pill. Caroline wasn't on it, or at least I thought she wasn't, since I had a vasectomy 2 years ago after the birth of our second child. Caroline had never had issues with cramps or period pain, so why would there be pills? Initially, I feared she might be ill and hiding it from me. My thoughts went to dark places for a few moments, but then I remembered our recent physical exams and the clear reports we had both seen. If the foil circle was here, the pills must be here too. I locked the door. Caroline was still in bed and began searching. After some time, I finally found them, hidden at the bottom of a tampon box inside an aspirin container. When I pulled out the strip, I recognized it immediately as the type she used before my vasectomy, and even before that, when we were avoiding pregnancy between our children. Why was she back on the pill? The only conclusion I could draw was that she might be having intimacy with someone who could potentially get her pregnant. She was cheating on me. Caroline and I had been together for 9 years. I had just finished my engineering degree, and she was working as a personal assistant. We had met at a bar. While our initial connection wasn't electric, there was enough interest for her to accept my dinner invitation. Caroline stood just an inch short of my 5'10". She was a former athlete with a well-maintained athletic build, lean frame and small chest. Her rear, my favorite feature, was particularly attractive. After dating for about a year, we married when I was 26. We had 2 children, ages 5 and 2, and I had undergone a procedure to ensure we wouldn't have more. 2 was our ideal number. James first and then Sonia. I thought I had the perfect family. Caroline had returned to work after maternity leave for both children, reluctant to leave a job she loved. We employed an au pair to look after the children during the day, though she was costing nearly as much as Caroline's salary. Still, Caroline didn't mind. She just wanted to be out of the house and working. I was working with a few friends, having started an engineering firm. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. I cleaned up the bathroom, returned her pills to where I found them, and decided I needed to think things through. Confronting her now would be pointless. I needed a plan and proof. What would happen after that? I wasn't sure. I needed to gather all the facts first and then see where they led. At work, I contemplated my options. I needed to find out who, when, and for how long. Was it someone at her workplace? Perhaps her boss? as cliché as that might be? The person she has been assisting since we met? This led to the even more distressing question. Were the kids even mine? Throughout this, I had kept my emotions in check. I knew they would come. Loss, betrayal, hurt, and anger. But first, I needed to verify if my suspicions were valid. I was dealing with a problem and lacked enough information to draw any conclusions. I turned to the internet. For my first task, I needed some DNA testing kits. Testing the children would be relatively straightforward. I often put them to bed before Caroline got home, which made the process easier. I also ordered some surveillance equipment, a couple of small voice recorders to discreetly place in her car and her bag, and a few tiny cameras to hide around the house. I didn't think she would be unfaithful at home, given the au pair's presence and the fact that Caroline was rarely there when I wasn't, or so I believed. I needed access to her phone. I knew of a cloning tool that would allow me to copy her phone, receive all her messages and emails, and even listen to her calls. To accomplish this, I needed to buy another phone. It took a few days for everything to arrive. During that time, I observed closely. Caroline's behavior was normal. Our intimacy life was routine, once or twice a week, usually on weekends when we both stayed in bed late. I didn't detect any unusual smells on her, nor did she rush to the shower as soon as she got home. Everything seemed unchanged. Either she wasn't having an affair, or she was extremely careful, or she had been involved in an affair for so long that it had become second nature. On Friday morning, the packages arrived. I had them sent to my office to avoid any questions. I received the DNA kits, voice recorders, several cameras, and the phone cloning kit. I was all set. That afternoon, I left the office early. When I got home, the au pair was feeding the kids their dinner before preparing them for bed. I let her continue while I went about hiding the cameras, one in the bathroom, one in the living room, and one in the bedroom, with a clear view of the bed. I heard the children playing in the bath and went to help get them ready for bed. I took Sonia and left the au pair with James. I swabbed Sonia's cheek and put the swab in my pocket. Then I laid her down and read to her until she fell asleep. James was still awake when I checked in, with the au pair still reading to him. I offered to take over so she could go home, and she gratefully accepted. Swabbing James was quick, and within 20 minutes, he, too, was sound asleep. I packed the swabs, including one from my own cheek, and put them in the mailbox. The postman will pick them up in the morning. The service promised that the results will be available online within 48 business hours. That is, by Wednesday at the latest. Caroline arrived home exactly at the appointed time, and we went about our usual business. She shared details about her day, and I shared mine, although neither of us paid much attention to the other. We had dinner, and then she went to take a shower. I took advantage of this moment to put the dictaphones in her car and bag and copy her mobile phone. I checked the cloned phone for compromising messages or emails, but found nothing. Either she was extremely careful, or she wasn't cheating. I couldn't decide. The weekend passed as usual. We both made love in the morning. It has become almost a ritual and even a kind of routine work. There were no calls or messages from her over the weekend. Since we spent all the time together, I couldn't check if she was taking pills, although I noticed that on some days the strip was missing. Since it was just the two of us at the house for the weekend, and since I didn't take them, it was reasonable to assume that she did it. On Monday, I told her that I would be working from home. She went to the office, and I took the opportunity to remove the flash drives from all the cameras and view them. The camera in the bathroom confirmed that she had indeed taken pills, but the real surprise came from the camera in the bedroom. On Saturday evening, while I was preparing dinner, she took a shower. I noticed her in the bedroom texting on her phone. Since I had already cloned her phone and found nothing suspicious, it seemed she must have another one. It certainly wasn't in her bag, so where could it be? I observed what she did with the phone after she finished texting. She went to the air conditioning duct, opened it by releasing the latch, and hid the phone inside. I immediately checked the duct and found that the phone was not there. She must hide it there when she's home, but take it with her when she leaves. I needed access to that phone. This was the first solid evidence that something was amiss, though I still wasn't sure what. The signs pointed to possible cheating, but it wasn't definite. I reviewed the footage of her getting dressed that morning and saw her retrieve the phone from the aircon unit and place it into her bag before leaving for the day. I needed that phone. That night, when she came home, I watched her closely. She carelessly dropped her bag in the hallway and went about her usual evening routine. After dinner, she took a shower, and I checked her bag. The phone wasn't there. She must have taken it with her and hidden it in the aircon unit when she went upstairs. What she didn't realize, or didn't care about, was that the other side of that vent opened into Sonia's room. Quietly, listening for the sound of the shower, I sneaked into my daughter's bedroom and opened the vent from her side. There was the phone. I grabbed it and took it to my office, quickly cloning it onto the new phone in just a few minutes. I returned it and was almost finished closing the vent when I heard my wife emerge from the shower. I went and sat by Sonia's bed, gently stroking her hair, just as my wife walked in. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "I like to come in and sit with one of them from time to time," I whispered, "just to remind myself how fortunate I am to have such wonderful kids." She smiled. "You old softy," she said. "Let's go before you wake her." I didn't get a chance to check the cloned phone until the next day. That was when everything came crashing down. The sound of the intercom from my secretary failed to reach me as I sat in my office chair, staring at the cloned phone, tears streaming down my face. Eventually, she must have gotten frustrated and knocked briefly before coming into my office. She peeked her head around the door and saw me. Michelle, my secretary, was a straightforward woman who dressed much older than her age. I'd place her between 30 and 40, slim, with red hair and green eyes. She always wore conservative clothes that seemed more fitting for someone older. Our relationship had always been strictly professional. I had never even so much as looked at her inappropriately, although I had seen the fallout when others did. It wasn't pleasant. I had once had to address one of my business partners, known for his office flirtations, who had been hitting on her because he couldn't stand the idea of a woman not succumbing to his advances. She had made it very clear that if he didn't stop, she would leave and sue the company for both constructive dismissal and harassment. She said the only reason she hadn't already done so was because I had always treated her with respect and never acted inappropriately. My business partner was furious and demanded that she be fired immediately. He gave us an ultimatum: either she goes or he does. As a result, I ended up owning 60% of the company instead of the 40% I originally held. I lost a partner. When Michelle saw me, she quickly retreated, clearly to handle whatever she had been trying to contact me about. I heard voices in my outer office, followed by silence. Michelle returned, locked the door, and then came over to sit a couple of feet away from me, pulling a chair from the other side of my desk. She took out some tissues from that seemingly endless supply women always have and handed them to me. I took them and began wiping my eyes. "Tell me," she said. I showed her the phone. The messages on it were between Caroline and an unidentified person. Although no names were mentioned, the texts revealed secret meetings and an ongoing intimacy-ual relationship. The other person knew intimate details about Caroline, details that only a long-term lover would know, such as a mole on the inside of her thigh and the sound she made when she climaxed. I was never mentioned in the texts. It was as if I didn't exist. There were no references to my presence or absence, just complete disregard. "Do you know who it is?" she asked, still businesslike. I shook my head. "How did you find out?" she inquired. I explained how I found the small silver tab on the bathroom floor, and then the pills. I recounted everything, and as I spoke, she just sat there holding my hand. I realized that was the first time we had actually touched. "You need more information," she said. "The DNA results for the children will be back on Wednesday. Can you hold it together until then?" "I don't know," I replied. She nodded. "Our manufacturers in Portland need to see you urgently," she said. "I've booked you on the next flight. You'll be back by Thursday." "I can't focus on that right now," I said. "That's what you need to tell Caroline," she said. She took my phone, typed out a text message, and sent it to Caroline. "There's been a problem in Portland that I need to handle. I'll be back on Thursday. Love you." The reply came almost immediately. "Okay, let me know when you arrive safely. See you when you get back." She glanced at the phone for a moment, her lip curling, then handed my phone back and took out her own. "Lorraine," she said. "It's Michelle." "Yes, thanks. Are you free this afternoon? Great, see you then." "Get cleaned up," she instructed me in a businesslike tone. Her authoritative voice, and the fact that I was almost conditioned to follow her directions at the office, meant I did exactly that. It was actually a relief not to have to think or make decisions. When I emerged from the bathroom, she was holding my jacket. "Where are we going?" I asked. "You have an appointment with an old friend of mine," she replied. I went along with it. It turned out that Lorraine was Michelle's best friend and also a divorce lawyer. She had handled Michelle's divorce when her husband was caught with one of his co-workers. While Michelle explained the situation to Lorraine, I watched in a daze. It felt surreal. Lorraine, who had clearly dealt with similar situations before, focused her attention on me once she had the necessary information. "Gary," she said. It wasn't me she was addressing. I felt a sharp sting on my cheek. Michelle had slapped me. The shock brought me back to reality. Lorraine's initial look of surprise and amusement quickly faded as she turned her gaze back to me. "Gary?" she asked. I nodded. "Do you have any idea what you want to do about this?" My engineering mind kicked in at that moment. Plans. That was my forte. "Kill them both," I said. I expected Michelle to react with shock, but to my surprise, she actually grinned. "All right," Lorraine said. "I understand. Unfortunately, that's not a viable option since it's against the law. However, we do have some legal alternatives. Would you like to go over those?" "Before we start," she continued, "I'm just outlining your options, not endorsing any specific one at this point. That might come later. Your first option is to do nothing. As far as I know, she isn't aware that you know, and your life seemed happy before. It doesn't have to change. You could continue as if you were unaware. Second, you could pursue an amicable divorce, file for irreconcilable differences, divide the company, the house, and the 401k. Since she earns less than you might need to provide her with spousal support for a few years and child support until the kids finish high school. Third, you could go all out, file for adultery. If the children are not biologically yours, you could file for fraud on the birth certificate. Go after the other party. If they are the father, sue for reimbursement of all expenses related to the children. If it's a co-worker, sue for violating the company's fraternization policy. Most companies have one nowadays. If the other party is married, inform their spouse about the affair. If they knew about it, we might have a case against them. If they didn't, I could potentially represent them in their divorce. You could also go public. Tell everyone, friends, family, and co-workers. If she's involved in any societies or church groups, inform them as well. Aim to take her down as hard as possible. To protect your assets, you might want to sell your share of the company to an offshore trust, remortgage the house to extract as much equity as possible, and use the proceeds along with the money from the company and your 401k for a big spending spree in Vegas. My mind was racing. I quickly understood what she was suggesting. The first option was out of the question. I refused to be anyone's willing cuckold, especially after having been an unwilling and unaware one for too long. As for the second option, there was no way I was going to let her take half of everything I had built, only to continue having me support her while she was with someone else. Option 3, I said firmly. Nuclear. Lorraine smiled. All right. I'll start preparing the paperwork. I recommend we begin some covert surveillance on your wife to gather more evidence. Find out who she's with, when, and where. Can I keep the phone? It won't help you to have seen it. I nodded and handed her the phone. Michelle and I left Lorraine's office, and she took me to a small, family-run hotel where she arranged my booking. Go take a shower and order some room service, she instructed, taking full control of the situation. I'll return later with some things for you. I moved through the motions mechanically. My world was crumbling, and here I was, in a hotel room, ordering room service as if on a casual trip. It was the only way I could manage the stress of the situation. 9 years of my life down the drain. What stung the most was that I had been completely oblivious to it all. How had I missed what she was doing? Who was it? Was it the boss she kept running back to after each child? She claimed she loved the work and the independence, but was that the true reason? Or was it simply that she couldn't stay away from her lover for long? I glanced at the minibar with temptation and was about to give in when Michelle walked in. Don't even think about it, she said firmly. I need you to be focused, not drowning your sorrows. You need to plan, and you can't do that if you're viewing the world through the bottom of a bottle. Plan? I replied gloomily. I tried that. I had a plan, and it was a good one. I had a loving wife and 2 beautiful kids, and now look where I am. I have a wife who betrayed me, and I'm not even sure if the kids are mine. I'm the world's biggest fool. My life is in shambles. And you want me to plan? She stared at me for a moment. I waited for her to offer some sympathy, maybe even a hug. Instead, she checked her watch. All right, she said, switching to business mode. The pity party is over. How many times did you hit a roadblock when we were building the company? How many times did your plans fail? What's that got to do with how many times? She pressed. I don't know, I admitted. A lot. There was the time the patent office lost our application for the Inversi thread, and Headingley's beat us to it. There was a time the bank tried to foreclose early because of pressure. There was the time... Okay, she interrupted. At what point in all those failures did you sit down, put your head in your hands, and give up? That was different, I said. Why? She asked. What was so different about those times? I had something to fight for then, I said. I had a family depending on me. I had... You have a family now, she said, and they're just as dependent on you. Plus, there's a larger group counting on you. There are 141 people and their families relying on you to make it through. None of your partners can keep the company afloat. You're the only businessman among the engineers. If you go down, the company goes down. You think that woman cares about the families depending on your company? If she gets half, she'll sell it to the highest bidder and you'll lose control. Headingley's will end up owning everything you've worked for. Is that what you want? I looked at her, realizing she was right. I had put in too much effort and time to let it all slip away to whoever offered the most money to my estranged wife. I needed to organize everything to secure the future for myself and my family. If the children were mine, I'd ensure they were well taken care of. But as for Caroline, she had made her own choices and could deal with them as she wished. I would deal with the pain of that relationship once everything else was sorted out. With my fog of confusion lifted and fueled by anger and resolve, I sat down with Michelle to start planning. My focus was on securing the company's future and taking care of the only family I had left. As soon as I made that decision, everything fell into place. The hurt and indecision vanished, and I felt confident. Michelle noticed the change in my demeanor and nodded with approval. "That's the Gary I need," she said, "the one who knows how to plan for the future." We spent the rest of the evening strategizing to ensure the company's future. I initially considered selling my shares to my partners, but Michelle rejected that idea. She believed I couldn't trust them to manage the company properly or to leave its management in my hands once they became majority shareholders. They would likely ruin it. I needed to retain control. Ultimately, we decided to set up an offshore trust where I would sell the company at market value. I would then be retained by the trust as CEO at a minimal salary, earning next to nothing. Since the trust was offshore, the courts wouldn't have access to its records, so the owners would remain anonymous. On paper, I would be a millionaire, or at least would be once everything was completed. I needed to liquidate all that capital. I also had to cash in my 401k and unlock the equity in the house. Even though we had bought the house together, it was solely in my name since Caroline wasn't working at the time and was pregnant with James. The mortgage advisor had suggested it would be simpler to get the financing in my name alone due to her lack of income at that time. I made a list of what needed to be done and texted my lawyer, who handles the company's legal affairs, to schedule an appointment for the next day. After Michelle left, I took a shower and went to bed, not expecting to get much sleep. I ended up passing out almost as soon as my head hit the pillow and didn't wake up until my phone alarm went off the next morning. I had a message from Caroline on my phone. "You didn't let me know you arrived. Is everything okay?" "Sorry, I was working late and then fell asleep. Everything is coming together now. I should be back by Thursday." "Good. See you then. Love you." I didn't reply. I just couldn't bring myself to type those words. Michelle knocked on my door shortly after 8. I had taken another shower and was about to head out for breakfast. "Breakfast," she said, gesturing for me to follow her. We went to a diner down the street and had pancakes and bacon with maple syrup in a booth. Part of me couldn't understand why I was acting this way, as if my world hadn't just fallen apart and my heart hadn't been shattered. I reasoned that once the dust settled, it would all hit me. I wasn't looking forward to that, but in the meantime, I had tasks to handle. "Brian Spencer," Michelle said, naming my lawyer, called and said he has a slot at 10 to see us. "We can go to your bank first to cash out your 401k and release the equity in your house before we head there." "I see the logic in consolidating my cash," I said. "But won't the court just order me to pay her half since there will still be a record of it?" "Only if you still have it. Michelle said with a grin. That's where Vegas comes in. Once you have all that equity, you go to Vegas, spend it all in a week, and then file for divorce. When the court assesses your finances, you'll appear broke and in debt. The bank will foreclose on your house, and your salary will barely cover your living expenses. That is, assuming the kids aren't yours. If they are, you could put your 401k in trust for their college funds. Caroline won't be able to touch it, and she might end up earning more than you. She could even end up paying you maintenance. When do you get the DNA results? The company said the results should be online today, I said, picking up my phone. I checked the email from the company and saw a link. I clicked on it, watched the page start to load, then put my phone down. I wasn't sure I was ready to see the result yet. "May I?" Michelle asked, and I handed her the phone. She picked it up and looked at the screen, scrolling up a few times. I watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction. She looked up from the phone. "The results aren't ready yet," she said. "The tracking says they should be in within the next 12 hours. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "Come on," she said, getting up. "The bank should be open now." Releasing the equity from the house and cashing in my 401k was surprisingly quick. I closed all our savings accounts, including the kids' college funds, and moved the money into an account solely in my name. The only account I left untouched was the joint one we used daily, which had less than $10,000 in it. My lawyer threw a significant wrench into our plans, but if there was a good way to do it, he certainly found it. "You're overlooking something," he said when we presented our plan. "You have a prenuptial agreement." "I do?" I was taken aback. I had no idea. "It was a requirement of the partnership agreement when you started," he reminded me. All partners needed a prenup to safeguard the company in case any relationships failed. It only protects the company, so she has no claim on any company assets. For the purposes of the divorce, you are considered an employee of the company, so her claims can only be made against your salary and 401k. "What I recommend," he continued, "and with no disrespect to your divorce attorney's plan, is to invest all the capital you released from the house and your 401k back into the company. Consider buying out one of your partners. I know Robert has been hinting at wanting to cash out. While you don't have enough to cover it, you could take out a loan from the company pension fund to cover the shortfall. The loan payments would come from your salary, reducing your income for asset assessment purposes. Since everything else would be tied up in the company and thus untouchable, she would get nothing. We could even arrange for your salary to be less than hers, potentially resulting in her paying you support." "What am I supposed to live on?" I asked, "if all my salary is tied up in loan payments? I still need to cover basic living expenses and food. Not to mention I have 2 kids. I hesitated. "Well, at least I think I do." "Let's hold off on decisions about the children for now," he said. "Have you figured out what you'll do if it turns out they aren't yours? Will you still want to be involved in their lives?" "I'm not sure," I replied. "It's too painful to think about right now. I need to wait until I have definite answers before making those decisions." "Don't forget the other parts of your attorney's plans," he reminded me. "I'm confident you'll get a substantial settlement from her company, which should cover the loan and restore your full salary. Plus, if the children aren't yours, you might be able to reclaim expenses from their father. Since that will be settled after the divorce, it won't affect the settlement." "Could you approach Robert for me and see if he's interested in selling?" I asked. "I'm not sure I can handle it right now." He nodded. "I'll call him and let you know." We shook hands and left his office. As we walked out of the building, I felt a sense of relief. Things were beginning to fall into place, which always gave me a deep sense of satisfaction. Then I remembered the reason behind these plans. My relief faded, replaced by a hollow ache in my chest. While having lunch at the diner, I hesitated before checking my phone again. I couldn't bring myself to do more than click on the email link before handing the phone to Michelle. I watched her face, waiting for a reaction to reveal whether I was a father or not. "I'm so sorry, Gary," she said gently. It was the most unbusinesslike I'd ever seen her. She handed me the phone, and I read the results myself. Neither child was biologically mine. Although they shared the same father, it just wasn't me. The double blow of losing both children was overshadowed by the fury I felt at the betrayal. Not only had she deceived me into believing they were mine, but she had also convinced me to have a vasectomy, leaving me unable to have children of my own. "Gary," Michelle snapped, jolting me back to reality. "This isn't the time or place. Pull yourself together. We'll get through this. I promise." I took several deep breaths, struggling to control my anger. I had even considered severe measures, like hiring a hitman to deal with the man who fathered the children I thought were mine. Michelle took charge and led me out of the diner. "Lorraine called," she said. "She wants to see you." We headed to Lorraine's office. Lorraine had a stern expression when we walked into her office. "I've got a preliminary report from the private investigator," she said. "It seems Caroline didn't waste any time. A man came to your house last night and stayed over. We couldn't see what happened inside." "I have cameras set up inside the house," I replied. "I can swap out the flash drives and check the footage." "All right," Lorraine said. "Do that now, and then we can plan our next steps. I'm sure the information on those drives will be crucial." "The au pair will be there," I mentioned. "I can't go back myself. I'm supposed to be out of town on business." Lorraine checked her phone. "The au pair is at a play center with Sophie and James," she said. "I'll keep an eye on her and let you know if she leaves." My house was about a 30-minute drive from Lorraine's office, and Michelle drove quickly. We arrived without any problems, and I swapped out the flash drives. I took a quick look around the house but didn't see anything unusual. We returned to Lorraine's office and reviewed the flash drives. I decided not to watch the footage from the bedroom. I didn't need to see what happened there. I identified the man as soon as he entered the house. As I suspected, it was her boss, the man she had been working for throughout our relationship, Bill Wainwright. What really struck me was when he arrived at the house. He used his own key to get in. When he arrived, James looked up and saw him. "Daddy Bill!" James shouted, running to hug him. That moment was overwhelming. I broke down and began to cry uncontrollably. I couldn't watch anymore. Lorraine watched as I fell apart. For the first time ever, Michelle wrapped her arms around me and held me while I sobbed. It took a while, but eventually I managed to compose myself. "Do you need some time?" Lorraine asked, and I shook my head. The pain had lessened a bit, and the anger was starting to return. "What's the next step?" I asked. "I already have a copy of the employment terms and conditions from your wife's company. There's a non-fraternization policy, so you have a case against them for violating it. Since the person your wife is fraternizing with is a senior executive, the company can't claim they were unaware of the situation." We shared with Lorraine what my company lawyer had advised, and she broke into a broad smile. She picked up the phone, called him, and requested copies of the prenup, which he promptly emailed to her. "This is perfect," she said as she read the prenup. "Forget everything I said earlier. Your strategy is spot on. If your partner wants to sell his share, buy him out. Invest everything you have into the company to make it out of her reach. We can pursue action against her company for non-enforcement, him for alienation of affection, her for false claims on the birth certificate, and both of them for the money spent on the children so far. The deductible on the medical bills for the births alone is significant. It all hinges on whether Robert wants to sell, I said. We'll need to wait for his response. Michelle dropped me back at the hotel, and as I was about to sit on the bed, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find her standing in the hallway. "Come on," she said. "You can't stay here." "Why not?" I asked. "Because you shouldn't be alone," she said. "You'll either brood or raid the minibar. I want to keep an eye on you." While she spoke, she packed up my few belongings, took my arm, guided me out of the room, checked me out, and drove me to her car. "Where are we going?" I asked, not really caring much. "My place," she said. "I have a spare room you can use." "But," I started to say, but she gave me a look that made me stop. I'd never been to Michelle's house before and was surprised to find it nearly the same size as mine. While ours was spread over 2 levels, hers was a single floor. She showed me to a room with an ensuite bathroom. "Shower and change," she instructed. "Dinner in 30 minutes. We had dinner in silence. Although I assume it was good, I barely tasted it. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts that wouldn't settle. I was seething with anger but lacked the energy to express it. I was devastated, yet couldn't muster the energy to care. The only thing I could focus on was executing my plans. I was on autopilot, with my destination set. As I was thinking about what to do once I finished eating, my phone rang. I flinched, hoping it wasn't Caroline. It wasn't. "Hi, Robert," I said, my voice flat. "Why?" was his only question. Robert and I had been friends since university. We trained together, and it was a joint project that laid the foundation for our business. Initially, I had a larger share of the company because I had more capital to invest. "Caroline is cheating on me," I said woodenly. "Has been all along." "All along?" he asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "You mean—" "Neither of the kids is mine," I told him. There was silence on the other end of the line. "So you want to tie up all your assets in the company and hide behind the prenup?" he asked. Either Brian Spencer, our lawyer, had explained it to him, or he understood the partnership agreement better than I did. "I want to keep 5%, he said, "and stay on as a consulting engineer. I'll talk to HR about the details. The rest is yours." "Okay," I replied. "I'll have Brian draw up the paperwork." "Gary," he said after a pause. "I'm really sorry. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but it does get easier, I promise. I've been through something almost identical, and it does get better." It was only then that I remembered he had divorced about 4 years ago. I didn't know the details, as despite being friends, he was quite private. I just knew it hadn't been easy. That was why he remembered the prenup. He had used it himself. The next morning, Michelle brought me a cup of coffee. "Come on," she said. "We still have a lot to do." Our first stop was Brian Spencer, the company lawyer. He had already prepared all the paperwork for my buyout of Robert, and we completed the transaction in under 30 minutes. I provided everything I had taken from the house, my savings, and my 401k. I also had to take out a loan against the company pension scheme to cover the balance. On paper, I was now in debt by about $1 million. My salary was roughly halved, as the payments were deducted before tax. Next, we visited Lorraine. I showed her all the paperwork from the business transaction, and she was thrilled. "This is perfect," she said. "I'll file the paperwork today. We should be able to serve them on Monday if you'd like. We'll serve him, her, and the company simultaneously. Where would you like her served?" Wherever it would cause her the most embarrassment, I said. If you could manage it via a billboard during the Super Bowl, I'd gladly cover that expense. Lorraine chuckled. We'll serve her at her office, she replied. Monday at 10 a.m., assuming the papers clear the courts by then. If I file them today, I should get them back by tomorrow afternoon. I nodded. What's next? I asked, turning to Michelle, who was handling the situation. Now, she said, we have 2 more stops before you head back to the office and pretend you just returned from a fire in Portland. Do you think you can keep it together at home until Monday? I suppose I'll have to, I replied. Don't just suppose, she said. Tell me what you need to stay composed until then. I don't know, I said. Some good news? She smiled. Then let's go, she said. I was taken aback when we arrived at the medical center where I had my physicals and the procedure that ensured I would never be a father. What are we doing here? I asked. You wanted some good news? She said. Come on. I followed her into the clinic and waited while she spoke with the receptionist. The receptionist nodded and signaled for us to take a seat. We sat down. Less than 2 minutes later, my doctor came out and invited me into a consulting room. I looked at Michelle, who had not moved to follow. Please, I said, and she nodded and joined me. Dr. Harrington made no comment about my secretary being present for my consultation. He knew who she was and that she wasn't my wife, as he was both my and Caroline's doctor. Why I had asked my secretary to accompany me was my business, not his. Gary, he said, I understand you want to inquire about reversing your vasectomy. My eyes widened. Was that even possible? I glanced at Michelle, who had a small smile on her face. Yes, is it possible? Certainly, Dr. Harrington said. Since your vasectomy was less than 3 years ago, there is about a 95% success rate for reversal. The procedure is a bit longer than the original one and requires general anesthesia, but I'm confident you'll be able to father children again once we're done. Once again, tears welled up in my eyes. There was still a chance for me to become a father. It would require surgery, but that seemed a minor sacrifice if it meant having my own children. I had no idea who I might have children with, but at least it was a possibility. I understand it's a lot to absorb, the doctor said. Here is some information about the surgery and its costs. Unfortunately, it won't be covered by your insurance. If you decide to proceed, let me know and we can arrange a workup. Thank you, doctor, Michelle replied as she stood and took the information from him. We'll be in touch. I also stood and followed her out of the clinic and toward her car. Is this good news? She asked, smiling gently at me. On impulse, I wrapped my arms around her and held her close. Thank you, I murmured, burying my face in her hair. Then I realized what I had done. I quickly let go and stepped back. I'm so sorry, I said, flustered. Gary, she said softly. It's okay. We got into her car. One more stop, then back to the office, she said. I had visited Bill Wainwright's house several times over the years while Caroline worked for him. He and his wife Stephanie lived in a pleasant area just outside the city, in a gated community. They had hosted a few company events here. Why? I began to ask. Michelle got out of the car and walked toward the house. I followed. She didn't need to knock. Stephanie, having been informed by the guard that let us in, was already at the door to greet us. Gary, she said warmly, you must be Michelle, his secretary? Was it you who called? Yes, that was me, Michelle replied. Please come in, Stephanie invited. She led us into a room that looked like an office, just off the entrance hall. I had never been in this room before. From the pictures on the desk and the walls, it seemed to be Bill's office. She settled behind the desk and indicated the chairs opposite. It appeared she assumed this was a business matter. "How can I help you?" Stephanie asked, her eyes fixed on me. I sat there speechless and unable to respond. "Did you know?" I finally managed to ask. Stephanie let out a sad sigh. "No," she said. "I had my suspicions, but I never had any concrete proof. I could never find anything to present to a lawyer. Otherwise, I would have taken him for every penny he has." "Join the line," Michelle grumbled. "Do you have proof?" Stephanie inquired, and I nodded. "Proof that neither of my kids are mine, that they share the same father. There's video footage of him and Caroline at my house and my son calling him Da." I couldn't finish the sentence. A lump in my throat threatened to choke me, and once again I was at a loss. "Oh, Gary, I'm so sorry," she said. "I've suspected for years that he and Caroline were involved, but he was so careful. I had him followed, checked his phone, and his emails. I even confronted him about it, but he managed to convince me that I was just being paranoid. The private investigator I hired came up with nothing. I promise you, if I had been certain, if I had any proof, I would have come to you right away. But I couldn't dismantle what seemed like a happy marriage on mere suspicion. I needed to be certain, and I never managed to get any evidence." "What are you going to do now?" I debated whether to share my plans with the wife of my adversary, unsure if she might reveal everything to him as soon as he got home. It might be too late for him to make any significant changes, but I wanted it to be as much of a shock for him as it had been for me. "The question is, what will you do?" I asked. "Now that you have proof." She offered a small smile. "I understand," she said. "And I don't blame you. I wouldn't tell me either. If you have the name of a good divorce lawyer, I would appreciate it." Michelle pulled out a card from her purse and handed it to Stephanie. "Thank you," Stephanie said. "Will a week be enough time?" I nodded. "Perfect," she said. "I'll contact." She looked at the card. "And coordinate with her." She stood up, signaling that our meeting was over. Michelle and I rose as well. Stephanie approached me, giving me a brief hug and a kiss on the cheek. "Once again, I'm so sorry," she said. "Look after him," she added, directing this to Michelle, who had stiffened when Stephanie hugged me. "He deserves better than what that woman did to him." We returned to the office, and I spent the rest of the day catching up on work that I should have been doing while I was in Portland. At the end of the day, I went home. As usual, Michelle knocked on my door, poked her head in, and informed me that she was leaving for the evening. She had reverted to being the professional she always was, which left me feeling a pang of loss. I had thought I was getting a bit closer to her, but perhaps that was just my imagination. I wished her good night and thanked her for all her help. I stayed late at the office to catch up on work after my trip. "What time will you be home?" Caroline's text came in around 8. "Probably another hour or two. Got some catching up to do after my trip. I'll probably be asleep then. I have an early start tomorrow. Love you, XXX." Once again, I couldn't bring myself to reply. I continued working until almost 11, hoping Caroline would be asleep when I got home. The less interaction with her, the better I'd feel about it. When I arrived home, the house was dark. Everything seemed normal. I checked on Sonia and James. They were asleep, looking as adorable as ever. I felt a sob rise in my chest and had to retreat to the bathroom to hide. I couldn't let Caroline see me crying over children who weren't even mine. I still hadn't decided what to do about them. It seemed unlikely they'd remember me if I left. I had no obligation to them, but I loved them all the same. How could I abandon them when, less than 48 hours ago, they were my children, my flesh and blood, my pride and joy? Now, they were just further evidence of my wife's betrayal. I decided to wait and see what happened. The decision might be made for me anyway. I went to bed trying not to wake Caroline. It took me forever to fall asleep, and when my alarm went off the next morning, Caroline was already gone. The au pair was in the kitchen feeding the children when I entered. I looked at her, wondering if she knew. There was no way she couldn't know. Was she now looking at me, laughing at the fool who couldn't even satisfy his wife? Was she aware that the children weren't even mine? Had she taken them to say goodnight to Daddy Bill, as she had done so often with me? My mind wandered, and I envisioned her and Caroline in a sordid threesome with Bill Wainwright, while the children cried in the next room. Angrily, I shook my head. I decided she was aware of it all. By Monday, I would take great satisfaction in firing her and ensuring she never worked as an au pair again. I'd inform the agency that... Wait, what was I doing? I was taking my frustration out on someone who had little chance of handling the situation correctly. It was a no-win scenario. If she had confided in me, she would have lost her job. She could have left, I reasoned. But she seemed to care about the kids she had been looking after since before Sonia was born. I was lashing out, but likely at the wrong person. I headed to work. Michelle was already in the office when I arrived, as if the events of the previous days hadn't occurred. She was all business, although my planner showed she had cleared my schedule for something she labeled as marketing. I settled into my office and she brought in my morning coffee, as she had done every day for the past 9 years. Then she sat down across from me with a coffee of her own, something she had never done before. "Marketing?" I asked. "Since when do I handle marketing?" She flashed a rather mischievous grin that unexpectedly warmed me inside. "We need to plan," she said, "the final part of Lorraine's strategy." I looked at her, confused. "What?" "Telling everyone," Michelle said. "Her friends, family, church groups, volunteer groups, everyone she interacts with needs to know about her behavior and what she's been up to." "That won't make me look good," I said. "I'll be a laughingstock, a cuckold who can't satisfy his wife, raising another man's children." "You need to get your side of the story out first," she said. "If you don't, Caroline will, and it'll paint you in a far worse light, like an abusive husband or someone mistreating his kids. People will buy into that, and when we retaliate, she'll hit back hard. If you strike first, people will be less inclined to believe her counterclaims. Some might, but there's nothing you can do about that." Michelle assembled a media pack with all the evidence we had regarding Caroline's infidelity. This included the private investigator's report, copies of the DNA results proving I wasn't the father of my 2 kids, videos from my house, including one of James greeting Bill, and footage from the bedroom that I neither had seen nor wanted to see. Later that morning, I received an email from Lorraine. She had received a DNA sample from Bill through Stephanie, which she compared to the DNA test I had conducted. It confirmed that Bill was indeed the father of both children. I found myself pausing at the thought of the children. They suddenly no longer felt like my children. We updated the media pack with this new information and prepared it for distribution. The packets would be sent to Caroline's parents, my parents, and Caroline's brother and sister, with whom I was quite close. Electronic copies would be sent to all her Facebook and LinkedIn contacts, along with anyone else I could think of. For our immediate family, I arranged for a courier company to deliver the packets at 10 a.m. on Monday, the time when the news was set to break. I just needed to get through the weekend. I had a plan for that as well. As an engineer, it took me less than an hour to design and build a small device. It had a motor, a timer, and a battery. I set it so that the motor would activate after a set period, creating a jarring vibrate on. On Friday night, after the au pair had left, I hid the device under Sophie's pillow. It would activate at 6 the next morning, around the time we would normally wake. This would ensure Sophie woke up before me, preventing our usual weekend morning routine. It worked perfectly. Sophie woke me up by coming into our room and climbing into bed with us, which meant no morning intimacy. I smiled to myself. I kept myself occupied all of Saturday, tackling all the honey-do tasks Caroline had been urging me to complete for months. When she commented on it, I simply said it was about time I got around to them since she had been pestering me for so long. On Saturday night, Caroline unexpectedly tried to initiate intimacy, but I pretended to be asleep as she emerged from the bathroom. The next morning, her daughter once again came into her room, startled awake by my device. We decided to take the kids out on Sunday and spent the entire day at the zoo. Throughout the day, I looked at Caroline. The woman I had loved and believed loved me in return, and the 2 children I had cherished, thinking they were mine, and I nearly broke down. I bit the inside of my cheek until it bled to keep my emotions under control. But I got through the weekend. On Monday, I was eager. I told Caroline I'd be working from home and wanted to speak with the au pair. Caroline left for work at her usual time, briefly popping her head into my office to say goodbye. I pretended to be absorbed in an email and just grunted in response. I heard her car drive away and the garage door close. I checked my watch. 8:15. The au pair knocked on my office door. She wanted to take the children to the play center, but I said no. They needed to stay at the house. This surprised her since I had never refused her before, but she simply nodded and returned to the children. I heard James get upset because he wanted to go. Just after 9, Michelle arrived at the house. I was surprised but let her in. For the first time since I had known her, I made coffee for her. We had a teleconference with Lorraine at 9:30. "Gary," Lorraine said, "this is your last chance to reconsider. I'm not suggesting you should, but if you have any second thoughts after the weekend, now is the time to speak up." "No," I replied. "No second thoughts." "Then I'll see you on the other side," Lorraine said. It was on. I kept an eye on my email account, waiting for the confirmation service emails to come in. At exactly 10 a.m., the first one arrived, followed by the second about 3 minutes later, and the third 5 minutes after that. Then my phone rang. It wasn't Caroline, as I had expected, but my mother. "Gary?" she began. "Hi, Mom," I replied. "What's going on?" she asked. "Did you read the packet I sent?" I inquired. "Yes, but..." "Then you know as much as I do," I said. "Caroline has been cheating on me, probably throughout our entire marriage, with her boss. The kids aren't mine. I'm divorcing her." "Gary, can't you..." "No, Mom. I have to go. I have other calls coming in." I hung up. The phone rang immediately after. This time, it was Caroline. "Gary," she said. I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "We need to talk," she persisted. Still no response. "I'm coming home." Then she ended the call. "Caroline is on her way," I told Michelle. "I'll get out of your way," she said. I wanted to ask her to stay, but didn't know how. I just looked at her. "Call me," she said, "when you know what's happening." Then she left. Caroline arrived home about 20 minutes later. I heard her car pull into the driveway. She didn't even bother to park in the garage. I wasn't sure what to expect when she entered the house. I didn't know if she would act aggressively or penetrate with guilt. Instead, she came into my office and sat down at the table across from me. Gary, she began. Not interested. I cut her off. But, not interested, I repeated. Don't you even want to— No, I interrupted. I don't want to hear a single word from you. You've been lying to me for 9 years. None of the kids are mine, but you convinced me to have a vasectomy while you were still on the pill to keep sleeping with Daddy Bill. At these words, her eyes widened. So, no, Caroline, I continued. I'm not interested in what you have to say. My lawyer's card is in the package you received at checkout. If you think you have something I need to know, talk to her. But what about the children? She asked. What kind of children? I replied. I don't have children, and if it were up to you, I would never have them. I would ask why you did this to me, but I don't want to hear another lie. I'm not interested in your excuses. I just want this whole mess to be over so I can pick up what's left of my life and move on. I called the housekeeper into the room. I knew she could hear me through the open office door, and she was in the next room. You're fired, I said, effective immediately. Pack your things and leave. What? What is it? She asked. Why? Because you were covering for her, I said, pointing at Caroline. You knew she was sleeping with her boss. I don't know if you knew that the children were his and not mine, but you definitely knew what was going on. I have a video of you and Bill discussing children. Leave now. Gary, Caroline said. You can't fire her, I pay her salary. The au pair looked at Caroline with gratitude. Well, I said, I have already contacted the agency to inform them of your involvement in an extramarital affair, and I have agreed not to take any action against their company if they exclude you from their list. So if Caroline wants to keep you, she will have to pay your salary and settle all other issues such as taxes, vacations, pensions, illnesses, and insurance. The au pair's face paled. Not only did she lose her job, but she was also excluded from the agency's employee lists, which made it almost impossible for her to find another job. The agencies keep in touch with each other. Now get out, I said, and she hurriedly left. Did you have to do that? Caroline said. She shouldn't have. You're talking again, I interrupted. I told you I don't want to hear it. I want you to pack up, take your kids, and get out of my house. This is my house too, she said. That's not what the paperwork says, I stated firmly. It's solely in my name. So until the court rules otherwise, get out. Her eyes widened in shock at my outburst. James walked in at that moment. Mommy? He asked. Sonia fell down. Caroline, with a stunned look and tears streaming down her face, stood up and went to tend to her daughter. I shut my office door and remained inside while she packed up her things. A few minutes later, she returned with Sonia in her arms. Are you going to say goodbye to— Don't even mention it, I interrupted. She's not my daughter, and he's not my son. Take them to Daddy Bill and let him take care of his own. They have nothing to do with me. Gary, Get out! I heard the front door slam shut, followed by the sound of her car starting and driving away. I exhaled deeply, as if I had been holding my breath forever. I was shattered. I didn't hear the door open and jumped when a pair of arms enveloped me as I broke down, burying my head in my hands. Looking up, I saw Michelle holding me. She pulled me close and held me while I cried. It took me a while to regain my composure. I had just thrown away 9 years of my life, my marriage, my children, my entire world. I really didn't want to face the world anymore. Michelle once again took charge. Come on, she said. Lorraine mentioned it would take about 4 hours for Caroline to get an emergency occupation order. Since she has the kids, and this is the marital home, she'll be back. Do you really want to give her the satisfaction of being able to throw you out of your own home? We gathered some of my clothes and all of my important paperwork. I needed to figure out where to stay, so I loaded up both my car and Michelle's with my belongings and left. Initially, we went to the office, where I was served later that day. Lorraine had called to let me know to expect service. Not only was there an occupation order, but there was also a restraining order preventing me from coming within 100 yards of the house. If I wanted to retrieve anything, I would have to make an appointment and be accompanied by Caroline's lawyer, at my own expense. Without fully understanding what was happening, I found myself moving into Michelle's spare room. All my clothes were in the wardrobe and my paperwork was neatly filed in cabinets at the office. It had been a week since Caroline was served. I spent the time working and then returning to Michelle's house to eat and sleep. She brought me coffee in the morning, made breakfast, and we traveled to the office together. Nothing seemed to change between us. She remained all business, and other than the hug when I broke down at my house on the first day, I hadn't smiled at her. Not that I had much to smile about anyway. On Monday morning, we had an appointment with the lawyers from the company where Caroline and Bill worked. I wasn't aware of the specifics, but we were apparently suing for an amount the company could hardly afford. They had insurance, but it only covered up to $1 million, and we were suing for significantly more. Their lawyers were all business. Lorraine, my lawyer, was grinning like a Cheshire cat. "What will it take?" asked the opposing lawyer, "to get you to settle?" "Immediate and permanent termination with loss of pension of the senior party involved," Lorraine replied. "Also an undertaking to keep Caroline on the payroll for at least 3 years and $1.5 million. I wasn't really paying attention as they exchanged their arguments. In the end, they agreed on all the terms, but I would receive only about $750,000. That amount would at least cover a significant portion of my debt to the company pension fund. "This will be paid after the divorce is finalized," Lorraine said. They nodded in agreement. Lorraine also joined us for our next appointment, which was with Bill Wainwright's lawyers. After leaving their office, I was $500,000 richer. I now had enough to fully repay the pension fund loan and still have a nice sum left over. Or I would, once the divorce was complete. My final appointment of the day was with Caroline's lawyers. Caroline was present, but she didn't acknowledge me as I walked in. Michelle and Lorraine accompanied me. "The accounting on the divorce petition is absurd," Caroline's lawyer began. "Your client is a majority shareholder and CEO of a company valued at approximately $20 million. Not to mention the house, savings, and 401k. I propose—" "Let me stop you right there," Lorraine interjected, pulling out a stack of papers from her briefcase. "The company is not subject to division in this divorce, according to the prenuptial agreement signed by all parties. My client has recently made a substantial additional investment in the company, depleting most of his savings, all of his 401k, and taking out a loan against the house. He also had to borrow from the company pension fund. One of the partners wanted to sell, and it was crucial to prevent the shares from falling into the hands of a competitor who has been trying to acquire the business for years. Since the loan from the pension fund has reduced his salary, he now earns less than your client. I will be requesting a maintenance arrangement from the court to support him while he stabilizes his financial situation." "What about the children?" Lorraine's lawyer inquired. "There is DNA evidence proving that those children are not his," Lorraine replied. "She deliberately falsified birth records to name my client as the father in an attempt to defraud him. Additionally, we are considering pursuing damages for a serious assault, as she persuaded him to undergo a surgical sterilization under the false belief that he was the father of the children. The alternative is for your client to sign the divorce petition as it stands pack her belongings, and vacate the marital home, leaving it to my client. She will receive half of the joint account, which currently has a balance of $9,443.15. The lawyer reviewed the paperwork and the prenuptial agreement before turning to Caroline. For the first time, she looked at me. "Gary, please," she began. 9 years," I interrupted. 9 damned years. You lied to me every single day for 9 years. There's nothing you can say that I want to hear." Caroline glanced at her lawyer and nodded. She signed the documents. I wasn't present when she moved out. I received an email from her lawyers notifying me that the restraining order had been lifted and that the house was now mine. I was free to move back in whenever I chose. I considered it but decided against it. Instead, I put the house on the market. It didn't quite cover the outstanding mortgage, but I made up the difference, and the bank was satisfied. 2 months later, I was still staying in Michelle's spare room. After our divorce, Caroline had moved in with her parents. Despite all the evidence I had presented, they remained firmly on her side and refused to speak to me, which was no great loss. For some reason, Stephanie hadn't divorced Bill as she had promised. I wasn't interested in the details. Since losing his job and pension, Bill and Stephanie had to sell their house in the gated community and move to a smaller apartment. Bill managed to find a decent job thanks to his connections and skills, but it wasn't as lucrative as his previous position. I was unaware that he and Caroline were still seeing each other. I hadn't seen her since that day at her lawyer's office and had no desire to. I was sitting at my desk at work when Michelle knocked and entered without waiting for a response. "Bill Wainwright is dead," she announced bluntly. "What?" I asked. "How?" "Apparently Stephanie found him with Caroline again," she replied. "She shot him." I leaned back in my chair, unable to suppress the broad grin on my face. "Couldn't happen to a nicer guy," I eventually said. Michelle laughed. "Am I a terrible person?" I asked her, "for being glad about it?" "Not at all," Michelle said. "That sleazeball got what he deserved. Oh, and by the way, this just arrived." She placed an official-looking envelope on my desk. I eyed it with apprehension, knowing what was inside. I picked it up and tore it open. "That's it," I said. "I'm finally a free man." "Finally," Michelle said. Then she did the last thing I ever expected. She kissed me. It wasn't just a quick peck on the cheek or lips. It was a full-on, passionate, toe-curling kiss with tongues involved. When she finally let go, I sank back into my chair, breathless, astonished, and as stiff as a T-clipper's mainmast. She giggled, glancing down and noticing my clear arousal. "For 9 years," she said, "I've taken care of you. You are the most perfect man I have ever known. Not once did you ever look at me inappropriately, ogle my legs or my backside, or make any advances, and I loved you for that. I've waited 9 years for you, and now you are free. I know you have always respected me, and that is a form of love as well. We make an excellent team. I know you as well as any wife knows her husband, and if you think about it, you know me in the same way. Give me a chance to show you that not all women are deceitful, unfaithful, scheming bashes. Please." I was taken aback. I reflected on all the time I had spent with her before discovering the cheating. I thought about my feelings for her. I had defended her passionately against my business partner to the point where he was expelled from the business. I realized then that I had, and still had, genuine feelings for Michelle. I guessed it was impossible to work so closely with someone for so long and not develop some feelings. While I was with Caroline, there was never a need to scrutinize those feelings or quantify them, but now it was definitely necessary. "Say something?" she asked. her face showing concern. It was the first time I had ever seen her uncertain. "How many?" I asked. She looked confused. "How many what?" she asked. "Children," I said. "How many children should we have?"